Welcome to Business at the Speed of Coffee, the one television show for business, about business, by business. For some time, I've been concerned about trade. Why is that? Well, New Zealand's a small country at the end of the world, which produces enough food alone for over 35 million people. So trade is fundamentally important to our lifestyle in New Zealand. Standing astride of all this has been one individual who spent almost his entire working life dealing with trade matters. Turn on the radio in New Zealand, something about trade, you'll hear about and from Stephen Jacobi. So I was having a cup of coffee with my old friend Stephen recently, and we started chewing the fat about things in trade, and I thought our viewers would be interested to know what really happens behind the scenes, the things that really make a difference with our trading environment. So welcome to Business at the Speed of Coffee, Stephen.
Kim, good to see you. Great to be here.
Now, Stephen, I know that you have a long background in trade diplomacy, but it wasn't always like that. Where did life start for Stephen Jacobi?
Oh, well, that's quite a long story. But look, I was an immigrant to New Zealand. Very proud to be an immigrant. I was born in the UK. My family immigrated here in 1963, and we were part of that wave of immigration that came to New Zealand. We were assisted immigrants. So I'm here courtesy of the New Zealand taxpayer.
So your formative years actually were in England?
Well, actually, I was only 3 when we came, so not that formative. Obviously, I'm older than I look. But so I came as a very young child. My sisters are a bit older than me, but we came to New Zealand. My parents wanted a better life for us, and what a wonderful decision they made, and I can't thank them enough for doing that. But I'm an immigrant, so I came from outside.
And what sort of people were they? Industry people, educators?
They're working class people. They didn't have a tertiary education. My father had a good job in a factory in the UK, but we came to New Zealand and he got a job with Air New Zealand, another external connection. He worked for Air New Zealand for the rest of his working life. We lived out in South Auckland in Mangere near the airport. In fact, actually first at Whenuapai and then Mangere when the airport shifted. And had a very happy childhood growing up in 1960s New Zealand.
Okay. Did you go to university?
Yes, absolutely. I went to school in Mangere, Robertson Road Primary School, Mangere Intermediate, but I went to Auckland Grammar School. I got a bit of a break.
Yet another one.
Well, yeah, there are a few of us around. I got a break as a young guy to go to that fantastic school. Changed my life, changed my outlook. Had some challenges associated with it, coming from a working class background, going into grammar. I mean, I wasn't brought up in the leafy streets of Epsom or Remuera, but had a wonderful education there, Auckland University. So I grew up in Auckland. I've been in Auckland, worked for the government later, of course, so spent time overseas, but back in Auckland again.
What did you study at university?
Well, I did foreign languages. You know, most unusual, really. I don't know why I didn't become a lawyer. Everybody else did in my class. But I did a languages degree. I was passionate about languages at school. Again, this connection with the outside world. French, German, Latin were my big things at school. I did very well at school. I was Ducks of Auckland Grammar School in 1973, I'll have you know. In 1977. 1977, great year. Look, I was interested in other languages, other cultures, the big wide world, and I guess that's where I've tried to make my career.
So what was your first job?
You know, when I started at the Department of Trade and Industry, and you'll appreciate this, Kim, because I worked in import licensing.
Well, explain to our younger viewers what that was.
Well, it's very hard for me to actually believe it actually took place, but we had a system of import licensing in New Zealand that meant if you wanted to import a certain product, you needed a license.
They were a license to print money, right?
They were a license to print money. I worked in the transport section, and I was looking after the shipbuilding industry. So if anybody wanted to bring in a ship or a tug or an inflatable boat, they had to get an import license from me. As part of that whole system, we restricted, for example, Nelson Harbour Board that wanted to import a second-hand tug to be able to manoeuvre the ships that were coming in to take wood chips off overseas.
Now, do you see pressures there now to go back to that era around the world to a nostalgic era, if you like.
Yeah.
Hoping that the working man will be better off.
Yeah, I do see that, and it's a very seductive sort of thing. Well, can't we just stop this particular import, or can't we? Let's give an example. One that's come up from time to time is, can't we make all the railway wagons in New Zealand, for example? Let's not import them from China. Let's make them here in New Zealand. Yes, we can, but they are more expensive. The cost of that, of course, could impact on the cost of moving goods around the country, and we need to do that efficiently so that we can export around the world. The big problem with import licensing, of course, in New Zealand was that it required us to compensate those industries that were subject to the increased costs. So you recall we had a huge system of agricultural subsidies. We were subsidising the farmers because they were having to pay more when they bought the inputs that were subject to tariffs and import licensing.
And of course, as far as your transport goes, you weren't allowed to drive anything on a truck for more than 50 miles.
Well, all of that is part of how does the economy work better, more efficiently, so that we can develop the income we need to grow the country. I don't want to suggest for a moment, though, it's easy for business. It isn't. And Kim, you know this extremely well. The world is not a level playing field for our businesses anyway. It's tough to do business. It's tough to compete against others who themselves are protected and subsidised, and goodness knows New Zealand has faced these subsidies around the world for so many years, and we continue to do so.
Let's circle back to, from import licensing and your career now getting into trade, and I know that in the last 20 years you've been to almost every major trade negotiator New Zealand's had, either as on the desk for New Zealand or as a member of the industry. And I can reprise. I mean, there's APEC and there's been the China Council and so on. Can you go through and talk about some of those trade bloc meetings that you've been to? Yeah,
well, I guess I started out on this journey as an official. So firstly as a trade official, at the earlier stage trying to stop trade, then still working for the Department of Trade and Industry as a trade commissioner overseas. I had 4 years in Paris as assistant trade commissioner.
Using your French?
Using my French, yeah. I worked on the earliest steps towards the World Trade Organization through the GATT and the Uruguay, the Uruguay round,
and the Doha,
and later on Doha. But but then I left government, set up my own consulting company, was executive director of the New Zealand United States Council, worked very much on this a move to try to get a free trade agreement with the United States, which is where you and I
up there in Washington,
and trips to Washington, a lot of stuff done back home, very controversial at the time. The earliest moves towards TPP, I went to successive negotiating rounds, more from a business side of TPP. We finally got that through, only to have the huge disappointment of President Trump leaving. In the course of that work, I also set up the New Zealand International Business Forum, again, something you were connected with, and Business New Zealand as well, of course. This is major leaders from industry in New Zealand coming together and talking about how to promote our trade interests globally, particularly through trade negotiations, working cooperatively with the government where we can. Well, that changed the debate.
The mood of the whole thing.
That changed the debate. But I guess the question is it possible to do these plurilateral agreements today? I wonder about that.
In the world,
look at how long it took to do TPP. Another big one coming to a TV screen near you soon. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP.
Well, that's India, hasn't it?
Got India in it. It's very, very big. It's very hard to get agreement.
And lacking in ambition in some ways.
And as a result, lacking in ambition. And Lord knows, the WTO has taken a long time too to get back in.
That's work in progress. Stephen, how do you earn a crust these days? You still have your consultancy?
That's right. So Jacobi Consulting is my company that provides advice to mostly business and sometimes government clients around trade policy, international affairs, government relations and economic development. But most of my clients are these organisations. Sometimes I've helped to establish them, like the New Zealand International Business Forum or the New Zealand China Council. Or the APEC Business Advisory Council. So I'm a business consultant. I'm small business. And actually it's interesting because the way I think about this is It is business. I try to take a business approach to it. I'm not from the government, but I am here to help you.
Well, viewers, you may wish to use the services of the fine consultancy if you've got trade issues.
That's right, jacobi.co.nz.
They can give you a call, and how do they get a hold of you?
Well, they might like to look at my website, jacobi.co.nz. All contact details are there. I'm not from the government, but I am here to help you.
Stephen, the TPP and finally the CCPPT, I know that you personally put a lot of emotional energy into this. When it finally sort of happened, what did it feel like?
Well, when TPP was finally agreed and signed in Auckland, notwithstanding all the protests, I was just thrilled.
Yeah.
This was 10 years of work coming to an end. We finally had the FTA with the United States in a way that was acceptable, I thought, to New Zealand, and that would deliver great value. But equally, I was dismayed when not that long afterwards, President Trump took the United States out of TPP and completely ruined the one of the big things we were working for, which was that FTA with the US. Of course, we got it with Japan, which was equally as important to us. But we still don't have an FTA with the United States. I think there's some brave talk about trying to get one. And look, let me be clear on this. We do need to talk to the United States. It's a huge economic partner for New Zealand and in the world. We do have to find a way to move the relationship forward. But you remember, Kim, all that work we did about trying to fix the rock in the road of the nuclear issue, trying to build up connections, trying to get over past disagreements at the political level. We always thought we were allied with the United States on trade issues, even if we weren't, on military stuff. We got that fixed. Now we're doing all going really well, only to find that actually on the trade question, we couldn't come together. Personally, that has been deeply disappointing for me.
I do have to add, though, with the US pulling out, I was immensely proud of our government and also the strength that the Japanese showed to finally say, well, okay, we're going to do this anyway.
Anyway, correct.
And it was the one bright light on what was a very gloomy international trade horizon. And it is to everyone's credit that it's there. And okay, it's not exactly what... And I think we have to hopefully beat an optimistic heart that eventually we'll all outlast President Trump and eventually the US will join.
That's right. The overwhelming logic
is that
that at some point, they will, and we want China to join,
of course,
CPTPP as well in the future.
Now, Stephen, the old saw bilateralism and multilateralism. I know that President Xi has been quite strong about multilateral connections. It would appear that President Trump is more binary. Where do you think, and what do you talk about the various options?
Well, look, a couple of things here. I think if you're the United States, then possibly bilateral approaches would make sense. After all, you're a big country, and you can use that to your best advantage with your counterpart. I guess the Chinese might make the same calculation. But if you're a small country like New Zealand, do you prefer that, or do you prefer a plurilateral, many partners approach? We've negotiated bilateral FTAs with China.
Originally with Singapore.
And with Australia.
Yeah.
But we have found that plurilateral approaches tend to be better because it means that we can make common cause with other parties against the larger player. So I think it's to do with size and scale. I think for New Zealand, it makes sense to negotiate with others. There's another issue, though, that's important, and that is a business issue. Business does not want to see a whole range of confusing and conflicting trade agreements. This is the noodle bowl.
Yeah, it makes it complicated.
It just makes it too complicated.
They conflict with each other and so on.
And so we need to find a way to rationalise that. So it doesn't matter if bilateral agreements generally point in the same direction and generally get the same sort of provisions, but plurilateral agreements that put these all up on one scale, on one plate, if you like, I think are preferable. The question the public asks itself is, why do we need to negotiate these deals like TPP, which may impinge on our sovereignty, which may, not that I think they do, raise the cost of pharmaceuticals, which may require our high-tech companies to surrender their intellectual property. They don't get that, and that's the bit that we have to explain. But the key thing here is that we need to engage with the rest of the world. If we want the rest of the world to do some things that we want them to do, get rid of their subsidies, get rid of their protection, open up market access, we need to engage with that as well. And that has to be negotiated. And sometimes we can achieve the things we want to do, and sometimes we can't. But we need to explain at each stage why we are doing these sorts of things.
One of the, if the right term's pushback I've had from industry is a sense of slight resentment that the trade agenda is dominated by dairy and Fonterra. And, Fonterra's had some unfortunately bad press recently. Is the industry's perception that there is a bias towards Fonterra in government a fair one?
Well, the reason that a lot of attention is paid on the dairy industry in general and Fonterra in particular is that they face the biggest barriers around the world. They are the ones who face the highest tariffs.
Canadian dairy farmers?
Yeah, or European dairy farmers, or anybody's dairy farmers really.
Yeah.
They're like the shag on the rock.
Okay.
They're the ones who have not benefited from the huge waves of trade liberalisation that have gone through. But I don't think it's true that that the system just focuses on dairy
Well, if you look at
products.
the trade statistics, services are becoming a very big part of it.
Services are a very big part of it. Investment is a very big part of it. The tech sector is a very big part. Trade is changing. The way we're doing trade is changing. The way we're delivering trade is changing, and all of that is encompassed in trade agreements. But here again, I come back to this point. If we want to reshape the world so that it is better for our exporters, Fonterra, yes, but also our SMEs, our creative sector, and all these other things, we have to be involved in these processes. That means sometimes we have to talk about things like intellectual property and pharmaceuticals and all of these things, which is why we need to negotiate deals like TPP.
Yeah.
And trade can also address other issues. There was, you recall, the big accusation that climate change was never mentioned in TPP, for example.
Yeah.
The reason was because there was another process going on called the Paris negotiations, which was where the action was taking place. But TPP is the first international trade agreement of that type, a plurilateral trade agreement that includes environmental disciplines. It includes disciplines, a whole range of things.
And labour laws.
And labour laws as well.
Yeah.
So trade can actually be a force for good in all of these things. But I think we're overloading the trade agenda too much if we expect it to solve every problem that exists globally. And when it comes to President Trump and his particular outlook on the world, the question is it better or is it more likely to achieve success to take tariff action against other countries, or is it better to negotiate?
I think the jury's out on that yet.
Yeah, well, I think that the trouble with his approach is that the collateral damage is big, and now the world has been dragged into a recession potentially because of that action.
Now, Stephen, you were there with me when in Beijing at the APEC summit when we heard President Xi Jinping in, let's say, quite lyrical language talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, if anyone's been reading the book, Silk Roads, it's front and central of that.
Great book, Peter Frankopan's book, marvellous book.
If you dig into that and look at the vast scale and ambition of that, which is as much an economic strategy as it is a diplomatic one, have you seen evidence of it really working? Have you seen, what's your take on it?
Well, I think the jury is out still on whether Belt and Road is going to deliver the sort of development-led growth that President Xi Jinping and China wants to achieve. And I think there are multiple motivations behind Belt and Road. In fact, I just reflecting on China, and I've been doing, as you know, been spending a lot of time on China in recent years. I stopped doing the NZ-US Council after we thought we had TPP through. I moved on to working on the Chinese relationship, and China's just this big new player bursting onto the world stage, or at least regaining the prominence that it once had. Who could have foreseen this, back then? Belt and Road is seen as a major new way in which China is going to connect with the rest of the world. It's not just about building ports and bridges and all those things. It is about those things, particularly in developing nations close to China, but it's a much bigger vision. It's a different way of doing globalization, seen from the Chinese perspective, not driven by trade negotiations, but driven by cooperation programs.
But are there hooks in it? I mean, you can say, well, is it a giant banking operation? Well, in part, I suppose it is. If the loans become non-performing, and many of them will, does that then mean those people who are deeply in debt suddenly become clients of China and end up being beholden to them? That is a real fear, just like people have been to the World Bank. And certainly in Africa, there's evidence of this. And what does the West, if anything, have anything to worry about? Is there anything they should do? Or
well, I think there are risks associated with Belt and Road, and these risks need to be mitigated in some way, and they are most particularly for those countries who require Chinese finance to be able to accomplish the sorts of development.
I would argue that the Belt and Road is an enabler, and if it's done in a benign way, then it makes these countries wealthier and able then therefore to buy the sorts of things that we sell.
Yeah, I believe so too.
And also if it connects everybody up. And you're certainly seeing it going in spades. I think it's probably below the radar here in New Zealand what's happening through all the ex-stans, all through the old...
these are countries we know very little about.
And they're wealthy places, some of them. They've got a lot of resources, and of course, eventually they're going to be players and they're able to produce a lot of food and so on. Could well become competitors. But let's talk about some of the institutional issues that we face. The World Trade Organization is under threat, and the US doesn't want to appoint any judges. We've got the European Union with all sorts of strange issues. And I know that we were trying to get a trade deal with you, and you've worked there before. Is it going to be a situation where we deal with England or with what's left of the UK or the EU, or is there a way of navigating through what looked to me like a very rocky passage?
Well, just look at first at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, 19 years old now, and has created the framework for quite a significant expansion of trade over that time. The WTO is the glue that holds this whole thing together. It's what avoids us becoming a Chinese-led or a US-led
well, the Chinese
model.
have been admitted to it,
and the Chinese have been admitted, and a very good thing, and New Zealand was very involved in that. My boss, former boss Jim Sutton, led that on the part of New Zealand, and I'm very proud of what we were able to do there. But the WTO is what binds it all together, and it's critically important that we maintain the WTO, its rule-making functions, its dispute settlement functions, and this principle of the most favoured nation, which means if I'm going to liberalise my trade with you, Kim, then I'm going to have to do it to all these other people over here because they're all members of the WTO. Absolutely critical. The risk is that the dispute settlement system is collapsing. The United States will not appoint judges to the dispute
They're gaming
settlement
it, aren't
body.
they? Am I right in
Well,
saying?
it's a bit unclear. And we need to stop thinking about EU as just being a competitor. I need to remind myself of that on regular occasions. It's a potential partner for us now, to the extent that it wants to have the sort of world where we have rules and we have proper processes. And they are willing to look at a trade agreement with us. I think that's a great thing, and we need to get it done. It's not easy on the agricultural question, because even though they're not completely uncompetitive, they haven't changed their old ways. And that's the substance of the negotiation that's gone now. Britain is doing them no favours because it's leaving the European Union, as you know, through Brexit. Looks like it might happen on the 31st of October.
One way or another.
One way or another. I personally think it's a disaster for Britain, but it's really up to them, isn't it? It's up to them to make that. And if they can be global Britain, that it also has a stake in a rules-based international system, then we can negotiate with them as well. But I think there's probably quite a bit of quite a bumpy road ahead.
Probably surprised the Brexiteers, and I think Mr. Johnson hasn't really taken this on board. I've seen a growing maturity and sense of self-confidence coming off the continent, a belief in continental ideas in a way that we haven't seen before. And we've seen it the way the Danish Prime Minister was quite happy to speak her mind about somebody who wanted to buy part of her country. Which, if it wasn't so amusing, it would be quite a concern. And also we've seen the same thing with the way the EU is actually tolerating a whole range of populists and other kinds of political persuasions, and still, in my view, hanging together quite cohesively. The one work in progress that hasn't quite been resolved is the euro, which I think has still got issues. But I'm feeling much more confident about the EU. I think it looks, the United States of Europe is looking more likely than it ever has, in spite of all the naysays. What do you think?
Yeah, well, look, I think the EU is an extraordinary force for economic growth and development amongst its own members and the rest of the world. And it still has a particular outlook on some issues. It's not quite the same way that we might see them in New Zealand, but there's scope to actually find those areas where we can work together. I think another example we might have talked about is France.
Yeah.
Look at the way France is leading globally on things. Working
Climate
with New Zealand
change
on climate change. Yes, look at the Christchurch call. Look at the work that was done with New Zealand. Trying to find a solution to the issues in the Amazon, although that's complicated with Brazil. France is retaining this role. Britain, of course, is somewhat preoccupied. And I think that's a shame, because we're going to miss Britain's involvement in the EU because they were, within the EU, a force for, sound economic policy,
rule of law,
market-oriented approaches. We're going to miss that. But look, the European Union, I think, is a big, bold, brave experiment at trying to make borders less important and trying to build a community of nations.
Because we're getting close to the end of the show, I'd like to circle back finally to New Zealand, where we have a coalition government. It has been very much the convention, as long as I can remember, that no matter who was in government, the trade agenda had a reasonable, consistent approach to it. Are you observing that today with our coalition?
Yeah, I think we're back to bipartisanship to a certain extent. And you asked that question earlier, which I probably didn't answer. Do I see the public mood changing? I think we've climbed back from the big debate and let's face it, split around TPP. Labor came back on board with CPTPP. I think generally there's a much better consensus around things. The New Zealand First Party voted for CPTPP, the first trade agreement it ever voted for. Those are good things from our perspective. Do I think that the public concern about trade and globalisation has gone away? I don't think so. Because I think that these issues that rose to prominence in TPP, which is about to what extent do we have to give up some aspects of our sovereignty to participate in these big trade deals, could come back again, may well come back in the context of the NZEU agreement, but possibly not in quite the same way they did around there. Hopefully the political debate will have matured, and certainly from a business perspective, we want the politicians to work together to promote those interests on the part of New Zealand business.
And will Stephen Jacobi continue with this fight?
Well, I've always been interested in the way New Zealand connects with the world. I think through my life, as I look back on it now from my advanced age, I can see that I've had these opportunities to promote that, and I certainly will continue. We have some big challenges coming against, in the next coming years. The future of the order that has been created for trade, that New Zealand has benefited from, the critical relationships we have with the United States, China and the EU, as we've been discussing, are all going to come to the fore in the next few years. I think that it's very exciting. And the great thing we have now, though, Kim, that maybe we didn't have when I started my career, was we have a much wider range of New Zealand businesses who can foot it internationally, who've got great things that they can do, and who can really succeed on the global stage. And I think that's a really good thing for us going forward.
Well, Stephen Jacobi, thank you for being on Business at the Speed of Coffee.
Thanks.
On behalf of all New Zealanders, I thank you for your relentless optimism, your commitment to the task, and of course, being so effective at what is a very difficult and challenging environment. And thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Kim. Great to see you.